today we had the criminal conviction of Douglas Mackey, who's a pro-Trump social media influencer who used the name Ricky Vaughn, and in 2016 posted a variety of memes that mocked Hillary Clinton and her supporters, including ones that encourage people, instead of voting, or said if you want to vote for Hillary Clinton, send a text to this number. He was clearly mocking the stupidity of her supporters by doing that, but some of them actually believed it and fell for it. According to evidence presented by the prosecutors, a couple thousand people or so texted that number, presumably thinking they were voting, or maybe they just did it to build that case, who knows? But it's remarkable that they actually prosecuted 4 years after the fact this citizen for posting memes on Twitter in federal court, and today obtained a conviction that from a jury that said that the intention was a plot to deprive people of their voting rights, and he now faces multiple years in prison as a result of what were very obviously frivolous memes. You can find very similar ones from Hillary supporters, people who did not get prosecuted. What do you make of this case?
Well, it's an extremely significant case, but I'd like to begin by just correcting some of your description there to the best of my knowledge.
Sure.
Yes, people texted the number that he gave saying vote for this, but they texted the number after the media had covered these memes widely. And in fact, the government has not produced a single person that they say was tricked out of voting on the basis of these memes. So there's no specific, not a single specific aggrieved party claimed to have been deceived out of voting by these memes that were, as you point out, clearly satirical. I think it's the most important First Amendment case in the country, and here's why. The statute under which Mackey was prosecuted and just today convicted, it's a Ku Klux Klan Act. It was a statute originally designed to prevent the Ku Klux Klan from physically preventing African Americans from going to the polls. They have innovated upon this statute in order to encompass a term that we're all familiar with, disinformation. They've tortured this old statute in order to codify the disinformation scam into criminal law. And this represents a really important next stage of the regime's war on Americans. You know, we've been learning from the Twitter files, the collusion between the national security state and the big tech companies to shut people up and deplatform them. Now what we're seeing with Trump's indictment and this Mackey conviction, the meme conviction, is the next stage. We're beyond deplatforming from social media, which is the national security state issue. Now we're in a Department of Justice issue that's promulgating the next stage of deplatforming, which is putting people in prison, which I think is the penultimate stage. I think we can all imagine what the stage after that is. But we're seeing a real weaponization of the Justice Department as such. It's very dangerous. This Mackey meme case, I've said, is it's just as important to the First Amendment as the Kyle Rittenhouse case was to the Second Amendment. It's a critical case. It's the most important First Amendment case. It's going to appeal. It could go all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I wouldn't be so skeptical of the possibility that some people fell for satire. That's kind of the idea of satire, is that sometimes people get confused. Good satire generally confuses people about whether it's authentic. The notion that some people might have seen something like this floating by and were dumb enough to believe they could actually vote that way is something I'm willing to believe. But clearly the intention to prosecute him 4 years later had nothing to do with some genuine attempt to subvert the election or voting rights. Instead, it was to concoct any possibility for thinking of ways to prosecute people who were influential supporters of Donald Trump. But I think this is the important point, Darren, that sometimes I think people lose sight of, which is it isn't, what bothers them is not the Republican Party. If Jeb Bush had won, if Marco Rubio had won, if, some traditional like John McCain or Mitt Romney or whomever, Lindsey Graham for sure, They would be fine with that. That's all part of the game. The problem with Trump is that he ran against both Democrat and Republican orthodoxy and became a threat to the system to the point where, and I think that's why they're so intent on calling this 3-hour riot by people who, never brandished a weapon inside the Capitol, who hadn't gotten off their couch in, a long time, many of them, calling it insurrection, because that is a way, as you suggested earlier, you can criminalize the entire movement, not just Donald Trump and a handful of people, but the entire movement itself becomes an ongoing insurrectionary movement. That's when you get the U.S. security state involved in national security grounds. So I guess the question becomes, we lament these things. We talk about how the Democratic Party and its followers now reveres the CIA and the FBI and the Homeland Security, and rightfully so. Those are their allies in their intention to criminalize the Trump movement and to prosecute as many of the people in that movement as they can, beginning with Donald Trump. What is the proper response to all of that?
That's a great question. And just very quickly on the point about whether any voters were deceived, you're actually absolutely right. Even if there were people who were deceived by the satire, it's still, I think, First Amendment protected speech if it's satire. But my point earlier was simply to say they're not even alleging any such aggrieved party. They haven't presented a single person who even claims to have been deceived. So
they have evidence that they have evidence that number was called. But they can't prove why.
The number was texted.
Right, was texted, exactly.
Right, and they were texted, I believe, after his Twitter account had been deactivated, and the mainstream media was covering the story. So it could very well be people were texted just to see what happens. They don't know why people would, or they could have texted it and voted still. So the point is simply that there's not a single person the government presented to say, I texted and didn't vote because of this meme. And even if there were such people, which the government hasn't presented, you're right, it's satirical speech covered by the First Amendment.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.